Welcome back. Now, the latest research report by HSRC specialist, that's Dr. Justin Visagie, suggests that COVID-19 has widened the gap between cities and rural areas. While the report further says that all regions lost about a fifth of their jobs this between February and April, but cities started to show signs of recovery when the country had moved to level 3 lockdown alert. Now, HSRC research specialist, that's Justin Visagie, joins us now via Skype to talk more about this data. Thank you so much for your time and welcome to the South African Morning, Dr. Visagie. But I mean, this is quite a tragic report there to show that there seems to be a gap caused by this pandemic, and one city, on the other hand, may be recovering, while on the other hand, we're seeing rural areas still being much so affected.
Yes, thanks so much for having me on the show. In South Africa, we get used to hearing of a national unemployment rate that's anywhere between 25 and 30%, and that's a really high number. But what we sometimes fail to appreciate is that different groups of people face very different unemployment rates. So, if you're a skilled professional, your probabilities of employment are really good in South Africa. And one of the ways in which this plays itself out is between different communities living in different places. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that the COVID-19 pandemic has just amplified the inequalities and hit poorer regions and poorer communities harder than more affluent communities.
And let's talk about the data in more detail and perhaps even compare it in terms of cities and rural areas. Just starting with the cities now, how have they been impacted and what have they sort of attributed its recovery rate to?
Okay, so in terms of specific numbers, measuring unemployment, there are many different ways you can cut it. But to give a rough or a crude sense of the trends, in 2017, the difference between cities and rural areas in the unemployment rate was about 12 percentage points. So if you were living in a rural area, you faced an unemployment rate of around 30%, whereas if you were living in a city, you faced an unemployment rate of around 20%. But since the start of COVID and with the lockdown and everything that we've seen, we saw those unemployment rates jump up dramatically, both for cities and for rural areas. But the key difference is the trend over time. So where the metros start to pull back or at least solidify where they were at, in rural areas, we see the trend continuing. And so what it's meant is that the rural areas have ended on around of an unemployment rate of around 52%, which is, extremely high, whereas in cities, it's sitting on around 35%. So you can see that differential, where it was about 12%, it's now sitting at a much higher level of around 30%. So rural areas have been faced a much tougher time, and we might see these trends continue. But if I can also add that in talking about these differences between rural and urban areas, we also need to look within urban areas. If you just travel within any of South African cities, you can see that there's vastly different living standards between some places. And this shows in the unemployment data too. So if you're living in an informal settlement, for example, your unemployment rate is as high as 42%. Whereas if you were living in a suburb, the unemployment rate is only around 24%. Now, these are still very high numbers for both categories of people, but clearly what's happening is that different communities have different levels of resilience, they have different assets, essentially they're in different positions, and some are far better able to cope with the pandemic than others.
And with that being said, I mean, has the government grant, the relief efforts by government helped at all during this time?
So the social relief has definitely been very important in certainly in the short term in trying to ameliorate the crisis. Having said that, not having a job, in some senses has a long-term impact on a family, and in many respects drives our inequalities. So social grants have been really important, and they've played an important role, certainly in terms of an indicator like hunger. So in the data that we look at, we see that the rates of hunger starting to fall as the lockdown was lifted and as the special top-up of social grants rolled out. But having said that, I think rates of hunger in rural areas, for example, were still as high as 20%. So 20% of households reporting someone had gone hungry in the past week. So this is a real human crisis, and something that we're going to be facing for the next few months or next year.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Justin Visagie, for highlighting this issue and joining us right here on the South African Morning.